All right, we're going to get started here shortly. If everyone can take their seats.
I've got them rounded up. I mean, all right, we're going to start even if you're not settled in. So try to grab a seat if you can. And I'm going to turn the mic over to my friend and colleague, Fred Cheever. Fred, of course, is a professor at the University of Denver Law School. And it looks like I'm not having much success in rounding you up, but maybe Fred will have better luck. Fred, go ahead.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Come on in. Settle down. We're going to start. This is like my evening property class. Come on. This is going to be hugely fun, right? This is a great conference, and this is, no deep secret, the best panel. So you got to be here right now. Okay. So first, we are extraordinarily fortunate to have three really deep-thinking, perceptive speakers. We will begin with Ken Raitt, who's the director of the U.S. Public Lands Project of the Pew Charitable Trusts. Previously, he was with the Campaign for American Wilderness. He's the former director of the Heritage Forest Campaign and the former conservation director of the Oregon Natural Resources Council. After Ken, we will have Brett Dixon from Conservation Science Partners, who is a conservation biologist, landscape and wildlife ecologist, longtime member of the Society of Conservation Biology, and an associate professor of the School of Earth Sciences and Environmental Sustainability at Northern Arizona University. And finally, we will have the great Kristen Bale, BLM Assistant Director for Renewable Resources and Planning, who came over to BLM from the Forest Service, and she was on the ground with the Forest Service. She was the former forest supervisor for the North Carolina National Forest. So each of our speakers will speak for roughly 15 minutes. We have slides, and then after that we will take questions. There's just such an extraordinary range of talent and perception in the room. I really hope we have lots of time for back and forth, and we have the disadvantage of being the panel before lunch, but the advantage of the fact that the conversations we begin here can continue out into the hall after we're done. So with no further ado, Ken.
Thank you, Fred. Yes, we are all that stands in between you and lunch. We'll try to make this as painless as possible. So, good morning. I'm here to provide a status report on BLM's land conservation accomplishments under FLPMA. I'm going to speak about the conservation language in the statute and how BLM has met with those obligations, which really is a mixed bag. But this is also a story about an ocean liner that's slowly changing its course. I believe it can be a hopeful story, and in fact it must be because of the stakes involved. So FLPMA created a number of implied conservation provisions through things like multiple use, sustained yield, unnecessary and undue degradation, and other language. But this talk is going to focus on two explicit conservation provisions: wilderness and areas of critical environmental concern. And I assess the agency's regulations in the more granular manual direction, together with the more quantifiable outcomes as it relates to conservation. And because I believe that these are the most effective measure of the agency's conservation DNA. So starting with wilderness, I'm going to look at this in two different ways, one through Section 603 and one through Section 202. Section 603 of FLPMA mandates the inventory of the BLM lands and the establishment of wilderness study areas where appropriate. These inventories were done in the latter part of the 1970s and the early 80s. And of the 250 million acres of BLM lands, BLM established wilderness study areas on roughly 20 million acres, which is just 8% of the agency's domain. This is Mancos Mesa. It's an outstanding area in southeastern Utah's San Juan County. It's 110,000 acres. And there's a great story about Mancos Mesa. When the inventory was done, helicopter brings in the inventory crew, drops them down. They're to meet the helicopter back at a predetermined location at a predetermined time. At the end of the day, the crew is going to go out, do their inventory, try to assess the outstanding opportunities for solitude and primitive and unconfined recreation. Helicopter comes back. Inventory crew is nowhere to be found. Inventory crew got lost. Inventory crew gets found the next day after a cold night on Mancos Mesa, and they recommend, because of the outstanding opportunities for solitude, that the area be set aside as a wilderness study area. Their line manager whited out the recommendation and said the area actually lacks outstanding opportunities for solitude. Now, this was a rare instance where the area actually became a wilderness study area on appeal to the IBLA. But this is just one of scads of examples of what was going on during the 603 inventory. The problems were documented as systemic across the BLM domain. In 1984 and 1985, Ohio Congressman that John referred to earlier, John Seiberling, held oversight hearings on the BLM's wilderness study area assessments, the 603 process, and found, quote, in many cases, those areas which BLM dropped happen to coincide with things like tar sands in coal fields. Can you imagine a House Oversight Committee actually having hearings on there not being enough wilderness recognized? That was a very different time and a different place. Well, same place, different time. So if we take a look at the BLM lands and apply a roadless mask with very coarse roadless data, Tiger Roads data, just to see kind of what the universe of roadless lands on the BLM domain looks like, it comes out to about 161 million acres. And then when you lay in the wilderness study areas on top of that, it's still just 12% of the potential roadless areas. So another way to look at this is to kind of look at how the BLM's sister multiple use agency dealt with their roadless area review and evaluation. The Forest Service, they came up with 60 million acres, or about 30% of their domain, as having roadless/wilderness characteristics. And so you can see very different experiences that the BLM and the Forest Service had. The BLM 603 process was a huge disappointment. Now, this is not an indictment of the current BLM staff. Indeed, many of the current BLM staff weren't even born when these inventories were done, but this was really just a legacy that this current BLM inherited. Moving on to Section 201, 202, 201, 202 mandates the ongoing duty to inventory public lands and resource values and resource values, including wilderness, and to manage them accordingly. BLM has the authority to create wilderness study areas under Section 202, but as a result of an out-of-court settlement between then Secretary of Interior Gal Norton and then Utah Governor Mike Leavitt, the BLM abrogated that authority to create wilderness study areas under Section 202. Moving forward next on the tortuous timeline of 202 and wilderness came the wildlands policy, very likely the shortest lived policy initiative in the history of policies. It lasted for 6 months, maybe 5 months, from the time it was installed in December 2010 or adopted in 2010, and then rescinded after it was defunded by Congress 5 or 6 months later. And what we're left with is BLM's Manual 6310 and 6320. This is the BLM's internal guidance for conducting inventories and considering lands with wilderness characteristics. The manual came out in 2012, the instruction memorandum in 2013. And if we take a look at how this has been applied on the ground, let's move fast forward to 2015. BLM issued records of decision in 7 different planning areas. These planning areas cover 13.5 million acres. If you apply the roadless maps to these planning areas, it's something just over half of that, about 7 million acres. In total, BLM identified just 7% of these BLM lands, of the 13.5 million acres, as having wilderness characteristics. And just 1.2% of those lands, of the 13.6 million acres, are actually managed to protect those characteristics. These are disappointing conservation outcomes in the application of these agency manuals. In addition to this, which is unfortunately an ongoing problem, there are no minimum management standards, so the level of protection in lands being managed to protect wilderness characteristics, the standards of management, there are none. So they vary from very little to actually decent management. That said, 6310 and 6320 were born of good intent, and BLM is addressing some of the deficiencies through state-level guidance, but overall the manuals need to be strengthened both in language and in their implementation. In total, as it relates to wilderness, 201, 202 have done precious little to right the documented wrongs of the 603 process. But in contrast to the 603 process, which is complete at this point, the 202 remains a work in progress as BLM rolls through the resource management plans. The next thing to talk about is areas of critical environmental concern. That's pretty clear language, right? That's what it says in FLPMA. The Secretary shall give priority to the designation and protection of areas of critical environmental concern. The regulations that BLM established after the passage of FLPMA were actually quite good as it relates to areas of critical environmental concern, but then during the Reagan administration and James Watt's tenure over the Department of the Interior, those regulations were gutted, and unfortunately they've never been patched back together. Indeed, in September of 1990, the GAO came out with a report on ACECs and found, quote, BLM field office managers have used broad discretion in conjunction with their own philosophical views to make inconsistent ACEC designation decisions. In fact, ACECs were not even singled out as a planning issue, and some of the plans GAO reviewed, GAO believes the potential exists for continued inconsistencies in the future. That's quite an indictment of how BLM was meeting its obligations as it relates to the priority language in FLPMA. So currently, there are 1,092 ACECs on the BLM domain, covering about 20.5 million acres. But the key question is, how are these lands protected? Are they protected? Or how are they managed? Are they managed to protect the values for which they're identified? Take a look at 2 planning areas. The Kobuk-Seward in Alaska planning area established a number of ACECs. The 2 I'll talk about are the Western Arctic Caribou Herd Insect Relief Area and then the Nulato Hills at 1.5 and 1 million acres respectively. These are large ACECs. The plan, the Kobuk-Seward plan that established these ACECs also opened the areas up, those areas in particular, up to oil and gas leasing. Previously, those areas had not been open to oil and gas leasing, but the plans that created the ACECs opened them up. That doesn't seem very consistent with regards to how to actually protect values that the agency has identified. Black Mountain Ecosystem Management, ACEC, in the Kingman area in northwestern Arizona, 114,000 acres, same thing. Open to oil and gas leasing, mineral development. We've cataloged the ACECs and found that these are not isolated examples, but are really quite systemic. And but what we know is that the potential exists for the agency to right these wrongs through the agency's Planning 2.0 rulemaking process that's currently at play. And they can do that by restoring the priority language from FLPMA in the regulation. 27 scholars, many of whom are sitting in the room here today, agree when they wrote a letter to the BLM director in May of 2016 saying you got to restore that priority language in the regulation. Look, I don't want this to be a talk that's all doom and gloom, the normal environmentalist talk that's all doom and gloom. Redford had it wrong. This all is not lost. How many of you know that Robert Redford was a BLM activist? Anyone? Yeah, a couple. Yeah, he fought coal development in southern Utah's Caparowitz Plateau in the 70s. There has been positive movement by BLM, really solid steps forward in conservation in the last 15 years, and those really need to be recognized. The establishment of the National Landscape Conservation System, now the National Conservation Lands System, that Brian O'Donnell is going to talk about at lunch, 34 million acres strong of BLM's conservation repository, wilderness study areas, basically lots of designations, monuments short of ACECs. The National Petroleum Reserve, Alaska, 23 million acre chunk of land on Alaska's North Slope, largest contiguous block of public land in the nation, North America's duck factory. The Integrated Activity Plan that was signed in February of 2013 protects 5 special areas. This was the largest lands conservation measure of President Obama's first term. Our little feathered friend, the sage steppe ecosystem has been identified as one of the most endangered in the nation. BLM is the largest manager of sage steppe habitat. The sage steppe supports 350 species of wildlife, 14 million recreationists annually that generate $1 billion in economic output. In September of 2015, BLM applied special protections across 68 planning areas. Neil spoke to that a little bit earlier. This is the largest scale lands conservation measure of President Obama's second term. And then more recently, the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan, 11 million acres of BLM lands in Southern California's Mojave Desert, protected almost 3 million acres of national conservation land, significant protections for other BLM lands, provide the really responsible balance between renewable development, renewable energy development, and conservation. These are important steps, but there are still much greater needs out there. So going forward, important opportunities exist, some of which are currently at play. I'm going to talk about some specific policy pieces and then some broader contextual recommendations as I wrap it up. The first is Planning 2.0. This is really the current BLM's generational opportunity, and in many ways, this is going to be this agency's policy legacy. They got to get it right, and they got to get it right on ACECs. They need to restore the priority language. They need to allow ACECs to come out from under the shadow of James Watt. In addition, ACECs should have minimum management standards so that the values that are identified as the reason why those ACECs are protected are actually protected by the designation. Also, one other thing in Planning 2.0, landscape scale planning. Planning 2.0, the preamble mentions that construct 52 times, but it never appears in the rule itself. Let's carry that into the rule itself so that BLM can really be on the leading edge of landscape scale planning. Wildlife migration corridors. This is a very exciting and rapidly evolving area of science affecting public lands. We are now understanding more the fundamental role of preserving migration corridors for migrating species like mule deer, pronghorn, elk, and others. The most celebrated of these is the Hoback to Red Desert migration in western Wyoming, thousands of mule deer migrating 150 miles. BLM lands play a critical role in that. Planning 2.0 recognizes and actually incorporates wildlife migration corridors in the rule itself. How BLM implements that is going to be a real test, and we're excited about the prospect of BLM doing it right. BLM Manual 6320, let's get minimum management standards so that the lands that the agency recognizes as having wilderness characteristics are actually protected for those values. And also, we believe there should be mandatory conservation for certain classes of lands with wilderness characteristics, like those adjacent to already protected areas, like wilderness study areas, national parks, Forest Service or BLM wilderness, roadless areas. Oil and gas leasing reform, it's another rich area for potential reform. I imagine that Nada Culver is going to speak about that this afternoon. But certainly the area of lease suspensions that frankly was at play in the issue that Robert Redford was upset about in Utah, which is why coal development was still an issue in the 90s. This is a ripe area for the BLM to be considering as it goes forward with policy reforms. And then finally, we need to reverse the policy as it relates to the creation of wilderness study areas under Section 202, and BLM needs to reach out and re-embrace that. I'm going to talk just about a couple of general framing pieces, and then I'll end economics and then biological diversity. BLM really has the opportunity to redefine itself as America's outdoor recreation agency. If you need any convincing about the beauty of these lands, just go to Bob Wick's photos he's a BLM photographer. He is documenting the incredible majesty of these lands, and he creates a very compelling story. BLM lands receive not 16, but actually 60 million recreation visits annually that generate an economic output of $2.8 billion a year. In many ways, BLM lands are the goose that lays the golden egg for rural Western economies. BLM should own the outdoor recreation narrative. And then in terms of biological diversity, BLM lands are key to this country improving the status of biodiversity. Aichi Target 11, which BLM has endorsed, calls for 17% of the terrestrial areas in the U.S., Canada, and Mexico to be preserved by 2020 in order to protect biological diversity. BLM lands and the specific habitat types they support are key to getting to 17% from the 12% we're currently at. BLM lands in the United States are the seedbed for large conservation advances, of course, and we can look at the last 8 years that in each of the Obama administration terms, the largest terrestrial conservation advances were on BLM lands. So BLM's conservation mission under FLPMA remains a work in progress, and BLM progress is a process. It's not a single step, but opportunities exist right now for BLM to move the conservation ball forward. So, thank you.
Everybody, it's really an honor to be here. First, I just wanted to acknowledge my co-authors at Conservation Science Partners, Northern Arizona University, and the Nature Conservancy. I'm going to be talking about the landscape ecological science that we've been doing for a number of years to support the work of Pew and a number of other partners that are working on the ground and, quite frankly, help to keep a lot of the academic science that we've been doing tethered to the ground so that we're not up in the academic stratosphere with the science that we've been working on. So just a little bit of background to start us off. About 25% of the nearly 2.5 billion acres in the U.S. are federally owned. About 250 million of these acres are managed by the Bureau of Land Management. These lands encompass a wide array of natural, historical, cultural, scenic, and recreational assets of social significance. They provide habitat for about 245 listed plant and animal species, including roughly 20% of the nation's imperiled species. These lands also harbor about 450 of the 800 rare plants found on public lands. So these ecological assets are quite significant, right? But what about the ecological processes that these lands have the capacity to facilitate? That's what I really wanted to focus on today. So these lands really present a significant opportunity to connect the last vast places of the existing network of protected areas in the western U.S. And I put network in quotes. I'll be coming back to that shortly. And so right now, Bureau of Land Management lands harbor about 4% wilderness lands, about 7% other NCL or NLCS lands, as well as 8% of these other administratively protected lands, including areas of environmental critical concern or ACECs. roughly 80% or more of these lands are currently unprotected. So that's that vast extent that we wanted to focus our ecological analyses on. And so our core objective with this research was really to identify, to quantify, and map contiguous areas of unprotected and roadless BLM land in the West, and that possessed high levels of biodiversity, high levels of resilience to climate change, and high levels of landscape connectivity. And it's really the landscape connectivity part that I'm going to focus on today. So we had a number of methodological steps. All of these steps are built on a foundation of published scientific research. So I'm just going to skim the surface of the methodologies we use. If you have any questions about the methods that we're bringing into this work, let me know. I can answer those questions on the panel or over lunch and send you papers, et cetera, if you're so interested. So the first step involved characterizing the extent of truly, as far as we could get, or as close as we could get to truly roadless lands across BLM's domain and in the 11 western states. I'll mention that we've repeated all of this work also for Alaska, but I'm just talking about the 11 western states in the conterminous U.S. We wanted to leverage readily available spatial data that could be used as these meaningful ecological indicators of high biodiversity, high resilience, and or high connectivity across this extent. And then we wanted to quantify and map areas that might be considered these conservation priority areas or high value core areas. And so that acronym CPAs, I'll be using that throughout, but this is just as part of a demonstration of the potential for these lands to facilitate connectivity. And so as it relates to our connectivity methods, first we wanted to estimate patterns of ecological connectivity, including these parameters that we call flow centrality as well as effective resistance among these conservation priority areas and across existing protected areas in the West. And I'm defining existing protected areas according to BLM NCO lands as well as IUCN Category 1 through 4 lands. And then finally, we wanted to integrate across these results so that we could inform efforts to locate new protected areas or other special designation lands within BLM's jurisdiction, but in a way that's conditioned across all jurisdictions. So just touching on a few of our earlier results that again created a certain foundation for this work. So what we're looking at here is in yellow, just think of these as histograms, these distributions. But we're looking at our conservation priority areas in yellow, and then current BLM protected areas in red. And so these are the 7 ecological indicators that we looked at. So very briefly, what we see is on the conservation priority areas that we identified when compared to BLM protected lands in the current portfolio, there was a statistically significant difference in, for example, species richness, vegetation diversity, surface water availability, and topographic complexity. That is, these conservation priority areas had higher values for these particular indicators than the current portfolio of protected areas on BLM lands. What we didn't see that was statistically significant but still quite striking was the degree of landscape naturalness or intactness, as well as the degree of landscape permeability. And for this particular analysis, permeability was really our proxy for connectivity, which we then decided to focus a bit more on. When you look at BLM lands versus other jurisdictions, and in this case we're just looking at U.S. Forest Service lands and Park Service lands, we've got BLM lands here in red, U.S. Forest Service lands and Park Service lands in green and blue respectively. What we noticed here was the degree of landscape permeability for BLM lands was even higher than U.S. Forest Service lands. So that was also pretty striking. And so this is what these conservation priority areas and these cores look like when you map them. And there's roughly 1,600 of them, right? They're focused within those currently unprotected roadless BLM lands. And what I've highlighted here, in addition to these conservation priority areas in red, high value cores in blue, are BLM protected lands in orange, and IUCN protected areas category 1 through 4 in pink, and I'll be using these color codes throughout. But another thing we noticed when we moved from those ecological indicators and the observations of patterns we had there was really this mapped result that reflected a certain archipelago of potential connectivity, just when we look at this sort of greater Utah region as one example. Okay, so that presented us with a certain set of hypotheses that we wanted to evaluate going forward and by focusing on ecological connectivity. So first, again, we've got these protected areas here in orange and pink. So this is our network that we're focusing on. Next, we look at the degree of landscape resistance. And this is our measure of human modification across the western U.S. So I've got high value resistance areas in red. High values for resistance in red, low values in blue. pink and orange are scattered throughout in terms of protected areas. This is the same map of the disappearing west that Mike Dombeck mentioned earlier. This is a map that you can go to disappearingwest.org and interact with. You can look at your favorite pixel. But that's a really significant data set that underlies the connectivity modeling that I'm going to be showing you here in a second. All of these models you can actually access on databasin.org. You can play with the data, so to speak. You can map your favorite place, and you can download the data. It's part of our effort to make everything freely available and transparent going forward. Next, what we did to improve sort of the computational efficiency of the work and also allow us to model or estimate ecological flow or connectivity, I use those interchangeably, in a wall-to-wall way across the West, is we just focused on basically the geometric center of a given protected area. And that becomes this network that we're actually focused on estimating connectivity between. So we had roughly 1,000 different protected area nodes. And then what we do to estimate this model of ecological flow is use a tool called CircuitScape. We're basically leveraging existing mathematical theory, existing physical theory, to estimate the potential for the landscape to facilitate the movement of any given organism across the West. We're not focused on any one species, and that's been a real breakthrough for this conservation connectivity science in the last few years. We call these models basically species agnostic. Okay, so here what we have in green are those protected area nodes, and then scaled from yellow to dark blue, we've got high values of connectivity or current flow. We're using principles of circuit theory, basically, to make these estimates. So we're looking for those areas that are in yellow. Those are the areas that are sort of popping on the map here. So that's high ecological flow potential, lower areas in blue and black. And you can really see that the central portion of the western U.S. begins to pop here. And when we sort of dissolve those results just into these particular jurisdictions and focusing on 5 principal jurisdictions, our measure of ecological flow in this case is what we call current density. What we see is BLM lands have the highest value of current density with a relatively low degree of variation around it than any other jurisdiction, broad federal jurisdiction in the western U.S. Now we can take that model of ecological flow and just sort of dissolve it down to BLM's domain. You can still see here that based on this sort of color ramp, the yellow areas in BLM's domain are really sort of popping out here. We can dissolve it even a little bit further. So this is the unprotected roadless areas now within BLM's domain. And now what I can bring in are those conservation priority areas that I mentioned earlier. And this is just a demonstration of these kinds of wall-to-wall connectivity maps and what we can do with them. So here on the left, I'm actually modeling what we call current flow centrality. And I'll zoom in on some of these results in a second. Current flow centrality is the potential for any one of these polygons, any one of these cores, these conservation priority areas, to facilitate connectivity across the entire network. A complementary measure is this measure of effective resistance to protected areas. So any one of those conservation priority areas in this case has the potential not only to be central to facilitating connectivity for animals and plants, but also to enhance the overall capacity of the network, the protected areas network, to facilitate ecological connectivity. Now we can take those results and we can literally add them together. That's sort of the beauty of this kind of math using probabilities like this. So we can add these results together, and what I'm doing here is I'm just combining effective resistance with current flow centrality to get this combined score, and then zooming in on a few places around the West. So still using the same sort of color ramp where we've got the high ecological flow based on centrality and resistance areas in yellow and low in the black and blue, and then red and orange in between. So here we're looking in basically the greater Hawaii Canyonlands region of southeastern Oregon, southwestern Idaho. We're looking for those yellow areas, right, to sort of pop off the map based on this example. Moving down to southeastern Utah. So this is basically the greater San Rafael Swell region. This had some of the highest values for current flow centrality and low effective resistance that we saw anywhere in the West. And then another example is just down here in northwestern Arizona. And the area is just adjacent to the Grand Canyon Parashant National Monument. So just a few concluding points here. So our results really for the first time quantify the conservation value of BLM lands, which form a certain connective tissue, if you will, across the current protected areas network. The methods and the maps that I'm showing you here, they're flexible, they're defensible, and they're accessible, right? Those data are all easily accessible and can be applied to multiple different types of analyses. I just gave you one demonstration of the data. Our results are applicable to many different landscape conservation and land allocation efforts that are ongoing on BLM as well as adjacent ownership. So those might include citizen wilderness proposals, but also ACECs, national monuments, and other NCL lands. And finally, and ultimately, I think what we're trying to do is all head toward an enhanced, systematically defined, and truly connected network of protected areas in the western U.S. I think we know that our current protected areas network was not necessarily based on a systematic approach, right? There were political opportunities, et cetera, that allowed us to have this current network that we have. But I think what we have the opportunity to do now is be very deliberate and science-based about where we might target these next opportunities to enhance and truly connect a protected areas network. So just a couple of examples of how we've been applying these results, that is grounding our work to the ground quite literally. Up in the upper left is that greater Hawaii Canyonlands region that I mentioned. That has the highest value of connectivity than we've seen anywhere else in the western U.S. Okay, so that's just in a proposal. Basin and Range National Monument. Some of these models were sort of underpinning the nomination, the proclamation, and then the designation of Basin and Range National Monument, which we're really proud of that. Greater Grand Canyon Heritage National Monument. There's a proposal out right now. We see also, again, some of the highest values for ecological flow or connectivity of anywhere else in the western U.S. And then a number of different ACECs. We've worked on about 8 or 9 ACECs, including work in Alaska. And just looking at the Sand Creek Corridor ACEC in eastern Idaho, you can just see that ecological flow moving right through that proposed ACEC boundary. Okay, with that, I'll stop there. Happy to take questions on the panel or at lunch. Thank you for your time.
Good morning. My slides are going to be a little bit different in that most of them will be at the end, but it never hurts to have some eye candy to look at while I'm talking and appreciating one of the many exceptional areas on our public lands. And I was looking for Director Cornsey a few minutes ago because I'm going to steal a little bit of his thunder. There he is. He's back there. I'm going to steal some thunder from you because I'm going to start off with one of the messages that we're putting out there for the 40th anniversary, and that is, these are your lands, America. And that means so much to me. And one of the things when I was thinking about this talk was the fact that right at the beginning of FLPMA, it says public lands will be retained in federal ownership. So that promise to the folks at that time and to future generations that these are your lands, America. And we're talking a lot today about multiple use and sustained yield and what that means both now in the past and in the future. And there's a lot of ways we'll describe it. The one way that when I talk to folks about the Bureau of Land Management and what we do, I say that it means thoughtful development in the right places to drive economic opportunities for local communities while protecting natural, cultural, and historic places and resources. So essentially doing it all, right? And while the wording of the multiple use and sustained yield mission of the Bureau of Land Management hasn't changed in the last 40 years since FLPMA was passed, we sure have started to do a lot of new and different things. We showed earlier the information that we're sharing, telling our story about what public lands means to Americans. For example, in 2015, BLM managed public lands contributed $88 billion to the nation's economic output and supported more than 374,000 jobs. And as part of that, we're doing things now that they never thought of back in 1976. Wind and solar, renewable energy. I mean, who would have thought that 40 years ago? Ken alluded to the recreation visits that we're now experiencing on our public lands. That has an amazing economic output as well. More than 44,000 jobs in 2015. But that's one way of talking about the story of multiple use and sustained yield. Not only has our mission become more complex, but I feel it's become more rich over the years. And that is really seen in our increasing breadth and depth of our commitment to conservation. Folks have been talking about some of the examples of that. Sage grouse, part of that is also the integrated rangeland fire strategy, the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan, mitigation policy, and Planning 2.0. So I'm not going to go into those because they either have been or will be spoken of. But those are some things where we have really begun to lean in on conservation. But one of the things that I've been exceptionally excited about are our national conservation lands and what we have done with that over the last couple decades. So thinking about the public lands, 245 million acres, about 10% of the land area of the United States. What we have done within the existing scope of FLPMA is created a network of national conservation lands that total more than 32 million acres. And that amount increases when you think about the conservation lands of the California desert. But think about that. FLPMA had that space to create that large, important, magnificent conservation lands network. That's pretty cool that a statute done 40 years ago was flexible enough and broad enough to allow us to do that. So Neil very much referred to multiple use and sustained yield being difficult. It has meant different things over time. It has meant different things to our different publics, and it may mean different things geographically. It involves choices and competition among uses, and that's never easy to work out. And conservation requires that you even more fully think about the needs of resources and their compatibility and whether they are sustainable over the long term. This balance has continued to be challenging to achieve and sometimes even describe. I mean, you'll probably get different answers when you ask, what does multiple use and sustained yield mean to you? But one answer to that has been how we have evolved in answering what we want to do with conservation and how that has changed over time. And now we have it sort of experienced throughout the country as a range of approaches from preservation to what we think about maybe as thoughtful use. And Congress spoke to the concept of conservation in FLPMA in several areas. Right at the beginning, in the general provisions, protecting the quality of a variety of resources and preserving and protecting certain public lands in their natural condition. Section 103, in the definition of multiple use itself, it means so they are utilized in the combination that best meets the present and future needs of the American people, making the most judicious use of the land for some or all of these resources, and the use of some land for less than all of the resources, taking into account the long-term needs of future generations, and managing without permanent impairment of the productivity of land and the quality of the environment. Sounds pretty conservation-minded to me. And then last, in the sustained yield, it speaks to the achievement and maintenance and perpetuity of a high-level annual or regular periodic output of the various renewable resources of the public lands. So several times we speak to conservation in FLPMA. So how did we get from FLPMA to what we now have is a more than 32 million acre system of national conservation lands? Well, actually, the individual designations that comprise the national conservation lands, some of them predated FLPMA. For example, the National Trails System Act of 1968, it established portions of the Pacific Crest National Scenic Trail on the Bureau of Land Management. And by the way, I'm going to slip in a plug for let's keep thinking about the 50th anniversary for not only the National Trail System Act, but our next act, which is the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act of 1968. And in that act, there were 2 rivers on the Bureau of Land Management public lands, the Rio Grande River in New Mexico and the Rogue River in Oregon, that were designated. So again, predating FLPMA. Wilderness is a little different story. BLM was not included in the Wilderness Act of 1964, but look at where we are today, and FLPMA has allowed us to get to this place. More than 223 wilderness areas, more than 8.7 million acres. So all that, again, encompassed in our FLPMA multiple use sustained yield mission. Ken spoke a lot about wilderness study areas and their relationship to FLPMA, and the BLM continues to conduct its inventory responsibilities, and I know that a lot of you all continue to work with Congress to look for opportunities to take our existing wilderness study areas and potential areas and consider them for permanent wilderness designation. We also heard earlier from Ken, he mentioned the national conservation lands going back to our King Range Conservation Area. So that was our first national conservation area, and we have grown since then to 16 national conservation areas and 5 similar designations. So again, and national conservation areas are designated by Congress, so they very much reflect what people want on their public lands because they are passed through legislation that is crafted with input from our local communities. And our national monuments. I don't want to take too much away from our lunchtime speaker, but the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument, that was a real change for the agency in terms of, in the past, when monument designations came about, it was often, well, sure, let's designate them and then pass along these lands, these special places to the Park Service to manage. It wasn't seen as a part of the BLM's mission to be a manager and steward of national monuments. Well, Secretary Babbitt at that time said, let's do something different. Let's designate the Grand Staircase and let's have BLM manage it. And so we began and now have grown since then considerably to 25 national monuments with more than 8 million acres. And so that kind of encompasses the individual designations, but stitching them all together. Brett talked about, you know, a network, and that was very much envisioned in what came out of the vision of Secretary Babbitt and the Clinton administration in making this a national landscape conservation system, a system of lands that looked at landscape level needs and issues for these special places. So the system was created administratively in the year 2000 and then had permanence established through the Omnibus Public Land Management Act of 2009. And in that act, it spelled out which designations were to be included in the National Landscape Conservation System, which we now call the National Conservation Lands. And immediately following that in 2010, and I want to read this to you because it really speaks to conservation and conservation lands. And this was from Secretarial Order 3308 that was issued in 2010. And it states that conservation of this nation's rich natural and cultural heritage is an equally important land management objective and an integral part of the BLM's multiple use and sustained yield mission. So very, very strong intent and a vision that it's here to stay, and that's very exciting. What's also really exciting is something that was spoken of in FLPMA, the California Desert Conservation Area, and later in 2009, where it was stated in the Public Land Management Act, OPLMA, that the conservation lands of the California desert were to be included as a component of the National Landscape Conservation System. But Congress left it up to the BLM to exactly figure out where those lands are. And through that unprecedented large landscape level planning effort, the Desert Renewable Energy and Conservation Plan, that covered more than 11 million acres of public lands, we finally got some lines drawn on the map to identify these areas. And I'm really excited that we have are now moving ahead to look at these areas and manage them in the future for their contribution to conservation as well as to the National Conservation Land System. So I want to leave you with a few thoughts and a few inspiring pictures so that hopefully those thoughts will come quite readily. To have you think about conservation of our public lands, the future of FLPMA, and where we want to go from here. For me, national conservation lands are a natural way for us, because they are so special, that we can grab people. People will visit them. They capture the imagination. They're gorgeous. They're important. They're amazing places. And let's continue to use those to get people to have that broader awareness and appreciation of our public lands and what we want to do into the future to continue to preserve, protect, and use them wisely. But for me, appreciation and awareness isn't enough. I want commitment. I want connection to these lands. I want people to really care about and be involved in the management of their public lands and in their conservation lands. I want us to continue to look towards our next generation of conservationists and public land stewards. So as I run through these slides and finish off my talk, I want you to think about a couple questions. And this should flow into a conversation that we're going to have later this afternoon. So these questions are, who will be here, assuming that we'll be back in this room 40 years from now, to celebrate FLPMA and our public lands? Some of us may be a little long in the tooth by then, but I'm really excited to see some of our younger faces here. But who are we going to have in this room with us? What's it going to look like? What are their interests going to be? What would it be like if every child in America in their civics class learned about their public lands and before they graduated into high school, had an opportunity to visit their public lands? What kind of constituency would we have if that happened? That's something that I think about, and I hope you do too. And finally, what is the future for our national conservation lands and conservation on our public lands in general? We've had some really intriguing ideas. We'll continue to have more talked about as the day goes forward, but I hope this is just a start of that conversation and to start getting you thinking about that. So for the last moment or so, I'm going to just do these amazing slides. Someone mentioned Bob Wick. That's him. So now you know why we love Bob Wick dearly. But this is another way that we connect and raise awareness of our public lands and our national conservation lands. Thank you.
Sean is winding up the microphone. I'm going to take the privilege as the as the moderator and ask the first set of questions. I've had a very polite panel, so that leaves it to me to bring up the F word, which is fragmentation. FLPMA, by its nature, by inventorying and designating lands in specific ways, breaks the public lands into smaller pieces, as your extraordinary science inventory map shows. Though you are mapping connectivity, aren't you paddling upstream against the basic designation structure of the statute? I'll add to that the D word, dynamism, right, which is the resources that allowed us to designate those lands in particular ways 20 or 30 or 35 years ago, are moving. They were moving 30 years ago. They're moving faster now. So we are, in many cases, advocating protections of pieces of land based on resources that are no longer there, will not be there in 20 years. How do we deal with fragmentation and dynamism under the current structure of FLPMA? Can we?
You want to start?
Yeah, I'll start. I mean, I can speak to some of the data that I presented and maybe a little less so to how the policy part of your question might be addressed. But I mentioned the Disappearing West data set, which underlied that human modification or landscape resistance data set I showed you. When I showed you a table that highlighted the fact that BLM lands had a higher value for current density, higher potential to allow ecological flow across that jurisdiction compared to the other four, I also highlighted a standard deviation, or the measure of precision around that number, the variance. That variance was relatively low, which suggests there's quite less fragmentation on those BLM lands than on those other jurisdictions. So what the data would tell me is that we're in a strong position to mitigate that number increasing, that variance increasing. But if you go to disappearingwest.org, you can actually interact with various data sets that are contributing to the fragmentation of the West and the various stressors that include oil and gas development, urbanization, transportation networks. And you can get a sense for which jurisdictions, which places, which states, counties, for example, congressional districts may be more or less affected by a loss of natural lands over time and an increase in fragmentation, if that helps.
So on your question of fragmentation, I think that that we may be with the Planning 2.0 initiative that's happening and BLM's recognition of the importance of landscape scale planning in that. I think that we may have like a key to get to thinking about landscapes in larger than just kind of single area ways that has been done in the past. And insofar as dynamism, you know, biological values, they're incredibly important, but there's many reasons why places are set aside. Recreational opportunities, solitude, there's a whole list of factors. And so, yes, these are fixed places on the map, and some of the values are in fact moving over time. Obviously the answer is just to protect more places.
I get to follow that, and I won't argue with you. So no, I would have also pointed to Planning 2.0. That is one thing that we are seeking to do, is to not be bound by administrative boundaries for asking the questions about what do our resources need, you know, based on the issues that need to be addressed, you know, what makes the most sense for those boundaries, and working early in the process through the assessment that we have proposed, that assessment process, getting people together to talk about what are the issues, and then at what scale do we need to be talking about these issues, and getting common grounding in those issues. You know, what are the wildlife connectivity issues? You know, what climate change adaptation may be needed? You know, all those different factors, and fragmentation. Also, we've spoke to mitigation. This is an opportunity to think ahead, because not only can we perhaps mitigate the actual impact, but where we can be working with other landowners, even private land, to make ready places on the public lands to reduce fragmentation as a way to offset what may go on private lands. A really exciting emerging opportunity that we're going to be moving ahead and figuring out exactly how that works. And then last, I would say that a glimpse of it is seen through the greater sage-grouse plans and plan amendments. You know, we looked at, you know, a lot of issues regarding what the bird needed throughout its population, worked very closely with scientists to figure out what is that best network of protected areas to provide what the species will need for persistence. And then looking at how we conduct uses, how we do mitigation, and how we do adaptive management through that by using the hard and soft triggers, and, you know, knowing that we are going to have to make some changes as we go. So I see a lot of hope in as we work through the greater sage-grouse plans. We'll start to get even more adept at that kind of work, and we'll be able to look at other areas.
Fred, I just want to add one thing, and that is that, and this is probably a key point, and I don't think it's been mentioned today, but the BLM, the 250 million acres, or 247 million acres managed by BLM, is broken up into 136 some odd planning units, and each of those planning units goes through new resource management plans every 15 to 20 years. The process has been identified as a slow one today, but the fact that these come up, which is kind of a built-in flexibility piece on FLPMA, provides an opportunity to kind of like move at least administrative designations around if in fact those designations are needed for the types of resources that actually move with climate change. So,
Jim, Sean.
Thanks. Great panel. So I want to suggest that there's no impediment in the law to do what we're talking about here. And I can read the sections if you want, but I think there's no need to do that. I think the real challenge is, I mean, obviously a political one, but probably even greater than that is the cultural one. I think that's the challenge that we face as we move forward. And I would say, and I attribute this to Mike's leadership previously and to Neil's now, but you know, we're going through a rapid evolution in how BLM employees view their mission, and we see this in the development of the sage-grouse plans. A number of us in the room lived through that. It was quite an experience. But we started to look at large landscapes. We started to use science more as a foundation for making management decisions. And I think what I want to say is we started to transition from being a reactive or responsive organization, much in the mindset of our job is to serve others, give land away, et cetera, to a proactive management-oriented organization. So we started to think about how we were going to use these lands, manage these lands. Use is actually a term I don't like to use because it has certain connotations within the history and the culture of the organization. We started to think about management. And I think if we think about management and we think about some of the direction we have, frankly, in the context of FLPMA, then I think we can move in this particular direction. I mean, I think the science is indicating, and Brett's work has been outstanding in this regard. It's the second time I've seen this, and I'm looking forward to the third and fourth and actually putting it to use. But I think, you know, the science is increasingly clear. You know, one directive, I have my old version of FLPMA. You can see it's been worked over pretty well. Aside from giving priority to the designation of ACECs, which I'll let Katie explain later in the planning role, there's a focus on consider present and potential uses of public lands and consider the relative scarcity of the values involved. So I think here the point to Brett's analysis is that these remain largely intact resources that provide a great deal of value that go well beyond the way we currently calculate value for the public lands. If we think about the nature of that value and the scarcity associated with these landscapes, what's at risk if we allow these areas to be broken up? I think it almost creates an imperative for us to take a proactive approach, working with partners, working with other interests, to develop a strategy to maintain and enhance these landscapes. And I would add one other element, because mitigation came up earlier. You know, I think we are building a toolkit that actually could allow us to sew these landscapes back together. We have many intact units. We'll mitigate for sage grouse to a net conservation gain. That affords us an opportunity to start to rebuild some of these landscapes. We're developing the tools to do more effective restoration through fire restoration, the seed strategy, et cetera. And the last thing I'd suggest, because this relates to place-based management, and Mike and I have spent a lot of time talking about this over the years, I would suggest that if we focus in on these places and engage those communities concerned about this, not only can we achieve a better conservation outcome, but I would suggest we can reinforce a much-needed focus on how we restore democracy in this country. Because conservation is very place-based. It's very much connected to people's engagement and concern about areas that matter most. Maybe this is a tool that we can use to start to rebuild the connectivity of communities, not just in an ecological sense, but in a social sense. And I think that could make a big difference. And I think all we need is written in FLPMA already.
Maybe two more? What do you think? One more. Okay. Negotiation. One more question. It was, all right.
Lunchtime.
Okay, lunch is hopefully ready. I think the students are hard at work outside. I've been visiting them a couple times. It looks like things are on track, much to my and Sean's relief. Just one observation I think I'd make about the panel before we break for lunch, and I wanted to just focus on Brett's slides, which I thought were interesting. And if you remember when he sort of isolated some particular tracts of land, I thought it was interesting that most of them were multi-state, and so they're relatively small tracts of land, but they involve more than one state. And of course, the BLM is organized around state boundaries, and it's food for thought maybe for some discussion this afternoon. So I just thought I'd kind of point that out. And enjoy your lunch. We're going to be just going up to the second floor, sort of right above where we are. Try to grab your food. We're going to start the lunch presentation by Brian O'Donnell at about 12:30. So try to get your lunch and get settled down. Hopefully enough food is up there for everybody, and we'll see you then. Who's not here?